My name is Rafe Gray. Not my real name, of course. I cannot divulge my real name for reasons that will become abundantly clear as you listen to this podcast. This is the third episode of a podcast about a murder that took place in Bladon in the late 60s. In March 1971, a person local to the town discovered a body on a small island in the River Trent. The body was, and is, referred to as Fred the Head. The island was not easily accessible and still isn't, even today. It is a secluded spot opposite the Royal Oak pub, which at the time the locals called the Sump Hole. You see, I know who the murder victim was and who killed him. There is copious information on the internet and in the press about this case, but most of it is based on conjecture, third-party testimony and, to be honest, misinformation. Fred was discovered interred in a kneeling position. His hands and feet were bound with cord. He had torticollis, a deformation of the upper spinal cord that resulted in Fred's case as a visible and perceptible crooked deformity in his neck. I knew Fred and had met him on several occasions around the town. I disliked him intensely. Why? Because I knew that he had a sexual predilection for young boys and girls. In short, he disgusted me. How do I know so much about the murder? Well, I was there when it took place. But before talking about the murder, I want to continue what I outlined in the first and second episodes, a summary of my now-deceased Uncle Horace Gray's past. In this episode, I explain how, when I was very young, my uncle started to involve me in some of his nefarious activities. I was born in 1950 in Bladon and have lived here all my life. I was only 7 years old by the time Uncle Horace had completed his national service and military training in the late 50s. I came from a working-class family. My father was a pipe fitter, plumber, and my mother worked part-time as a cleaner. We lived on a newly built council housing estate in a place called Winsill on the outskirts of Burton, not far from where Fred the Head's body was found. I'd seen my Uncle Horace a few times when I was even younger, but my first real interaction with him was 2 days before my 7th birthday. He came to our house, knocked on the door, and asked my dad if he could borrow the kid. Kid is what my uncle always called me from then on. In fact, I can only remember him calling me by my Christian name twice in my life. He gave my dad a couple of quid to go to the pub because he needed me to help him with something. My dad liked his drink and didn't need any more encouragement, so put on his coat and left the house immediately. I got into my uncle's blue Ford Thames van and he drove me to a place called Anglesey Road where we stopped and got out. It was mainly residential properties on one side of the road opposite, which were some business premises, a mixture of small offices, railway workshops, engine sheds and warehouses. We'd parked right outside one of the offices beside which was a small alleyway. My uncle went to the back of his van and took out a small tricycle. He left the rear doors of the van open, which I thought was odd. I was fascinated by all the other things that were in the back, things I'd never seen before, including 2 cylindrical tanks that I thought looked like bombs. He told me that he would go down the alleyway and enter the building via a side door, and that he would only be inside for a short while. I was to cycle up and down the pavement just outside and call out to him if anyone looked as if they were about to enter the building. I was nervous as I'd never ridden a bike before, but eventually got the hang of it and cycled to and fro, wobbling as I did so. But I didn't stray too far. A few people passed, but no one stopped near or outside the building. After about 10 minutes, my uncle reappeared at the alleyway entrance, groaning and panting. He struggled to carry a grey metal box to the van and dumped it in the back, followed by my bike. The box was about 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. I remember thinking how strong my uncle was. We got back into the van and drove about a mile or so to some railway arches at what was then a coal stock yard. My uncle backed the van up to one of the arches where he deposited the metal box before leaning into the back of the van to fiddle with the tanks and some hoses that attached to what looked like a prod of some description. I was fascinated when my uncle donned some goggles and lit the end of the prod. The flame burned bright orange at first, but after some knob twiddling, it transformed into a thin, blue, angry, hissing jet. I moved closer, but my uncle waved me away and told me not to look at the flame. He slowly moved the prod, describing a square around the handle in the center of the front of the box, to the right of which protruded 2 hinges. I learned a couple of years later that the device my uncle used was an oxyacetylene torch, and that the box was, in fact, a safe. My uncle became a regular visitor during the rest of that and the following years. I enjoyed being with him rather than going to school, which I bunked off regularly. I also went frequently to Wetmore Road to visit my granddad, who worked as a joiner for the Burton Gasworks. I remember clearly climbing the steep wooden steps that led from the pavement into his workshop. I loved the place, particularly the smell of fresh wood, the sawdust on the floor, and the sight of rows of neatly arranged tools that hung on the walls. I would spend a couple of hours there on each visit. Grandad's workmate Stan would make me a strong cup of tea and offer me a cigarette as soon as I walked in. Neither of the men berated me for not being at school. Both had left school at the age of 12 to find work and signed up at the age of 18 to fight in the First World War. After what they'd seen and done, neither cared much for or understood the value of a good education. During the following year, my uncle came to rely on my help more and more. He would drive me in his white Jag to shops and garages and wait in the car while I rushed around delivering brown paper parcels tied with string. In return, the business owners and managers would give me paper bags or envelopes containing something or other with strict instructions to make sure I gave them to Mr. Horace Gray. I soon realized that the parcels contained counterfeit money or forged car logbooks, and that the something or other in the paper bags I was given was money, real money. I hadn't realized at the time, and it was only later on that I discovered that it was actually my uncle who was printing the counterfeit money and car documents. As the summer months arrived, we started to travel further afield in my uncle's car, which was always jam-packed full of parcels. My relationship with my father had deteriorated, and I loved being with my uncle. Besides, it was a real adventure, traveling with him to different towns and cities all over the country, seeing sights I perhaps would otherwise never have seen. We even visited dog tracks and horse racing events to discreetly hand counterfeit money to bookies to pass on to unsuspecting punters as change or winnings. We would return later to retrieve our haul of genuine Bank of England printed notes. But my attitude towards my uncle began to change over the next few years. Hoping to enlighten me more about the world he inhabited, my uncle started to expose me to the side of his affairs from which he'd previously shielded me. Perhaps he wanted me to graduate from being his delivery boy apprentice to become one of his trusted right-hand men, someone upon whom he could rely to, shall we say, carry out an all-encompassing role. When I turned 11, I accompanied my uncle to visit someone who apparently owed him money. My lesson in criminality that day consisted of witnessing my Uncle Horace beat someone senseless in front of me, only a few yards away from where I was standing. He did so with such gusto that, for the first time in his company, I became truly scared. He explained to me afterwards that it was essential that people understood there would be consequences if they did not stick to their side of the bargain. In a separate incident, I was stabbed in the stomach when a fight between my uncle and another man broke out, and I intervened. My uncle was uninjured, and the culprit got away, but I was less lucky. The man had lashed out during the melee with what was probably a switchblade or flick knife and caught me. Fortunately, the knife wound was not too deep, and my uncle took me to the gypsy camp at Tatenhill to be treated. God only knows what the unction they applied contained, but explaining a knife wound to the doctors and nurses at the Burton Infirmary would have led to all sorts of unwelcome questions. Allow me to digress slightly. How did my Uncle Horace print his counterfeit money? In episode 2, I explained that Uncle Horace had moved what used to be the Mulligan Organisation's printing press from Burton to a friend's farm in Nottinghamshire. The farm no longer exists today, but was located in the vicinity of Redhill Marina. It was at the farm that Uncle Horace and his accomplices started their money and forged car document printing operation. However, in 1963, construction work started on the Ratcliffe-on-Soar power station, which eventually came into service in 1968. The power station construction work resulted in the area becoming extremely busy, with a vastly increased volume of both people and traffic. This worried my uncle, because it was essential that his and his accomplices' comings and goings remained totally clandestine. As a result, Horace moved the printing press to an old mill in North Derbyshire, which meant the temporary suspension of his counterfeiting operation. The mill required a degree of basic refurbishment, which also took time, but the press was moved into the basement when the work was complete. A few months after the printing press was moved, I accompanied my uncle to London to do, in his words, a job. Some men, who he wanted me to meet in Burton, had asked him to go to the city to take care of something. My uncle asked me to go with him. We parked up outside a pub, the precise location of which I cannot recall. My uncle took a shotgun out of the boot and walked over to and entered the establishment. A few seconds later, I heard a loud shot ring out. Uncle Horace returned calmly to the car, threw the gun on the back seat and drove off at speed. I had no idea, and still don't, who the victim was and whether he or she lived or died. The men in Burton my uncle wanted me to meet were in fact Sir Stanley and Jacob Menzies, both of whom, as mentioned previously, were involved in the Secret Service. How are these two individuals in Burton relevant to my uncle's and my story? Please bear with me and allow me to provide some context. In the 1950s, U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy oversaw a series of wide-ranging investigations to expose supposed communist infiltration of the U.S. government. No one, and I mean no one, was immune from being interrogated. But the paranoia about the Soviet Union's attempts to undermine the Western world was not confined to the U.S. It also extended to Britain, a primary ally. The Cold War was at its height. The British Secret Service knew that the USSR was in the process of infiltrating our society to influence our population's perception of the Soviet Union, so that, as a nation, we would be more sympathetic to and aligned with Soviet ideology and politics. There was an atmosphere of mistrust and fear that led to the Secret Service being suspicious of everyone who held left-leaning views, even if those views were moderate. It didn't matter whether they were trade union members or leaders, politicians or activists who expressed their political views overtly. Many were monitored, followed, or even had their phones tapped. But it wasn't just a battle over ideology. In parallel, a battle was raging over technological superiority, particularly with regard to nuclear capabilities. Espionage on both sides of the divide was escalating. One example of Soviet espionage was the exposure of a spy ring operating in Portland, Dorset. In 1961, following a tip-off the previous year, the British Secret Services arrested, charged and imprisoned 5 people who worked at the Admiralty underwater weapons establishment. The group, 2 of which were British, had been passing information to a KGB agent since 1953. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis heightened tensions even further, and the possibility of nuclear conflagration was on everybody's mind. If you think that this is all in the past, think again. The war in the Ukraine has reopened old wounds, wounds that many had thought healed after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, which led to the thawing of relations between Russia and the West. You only need to read the British and foreign press to understand the wider effect the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is having. A recent Bob Seeley article in The Telegraph, dated 20th of April 2023, states the following. For a long time it was only speculation. Now we know for certain. Russian spy ships are mapping wind farms and key cables off the British coast. There can be only one reason for this: to learn how to sabotage UK and European critical infrastructure in the event of a full-scale war with the West. Episode 4 of the podcast describes how Uncle Horace introduces me to his Secret Service mandarins, Sir Stanley and Jacob Menzies. It is after this meeting that my uncle and, to a lesser extent, I become embroiled in the paranoia of the intelligence services during the height of the Cold War. It also provides further insight into Soviet bloc interference in Britain and how I came to meet the man to whom we now refer as Fred the Head. Thank you for listening, and in the meantime, stay safe.